Everyone watching the Iran conflict has been operating on one assumption for months, that Iran's air defense network is broken, exposed, and functionally irrelevant. That assumption just expired. In an invented scenario worth thinking through carefully, imagine Iranian state media releases satellite counter-imagery showing a rebuilt, dispersed radar network across 3 provinces. And within 72 hours, Israel's Sortie planners are reportedly grounding missions they'd run without hesitation for the past year. That's the premise I want to walk through tonight, not as something that happened, but as a scenario worth taking seriously, because the underlying logic of how a degraded air defense network gets rebuilt is real. I want to be upfront about what this is. This is an analysis, a thought experiment built on real patterns of how militaries actually recover from degraded capability. I'm reporting facts about Iran. Tonight, I want to work through 4 questions that this kind of scenario forces onto the table. First, if a nation's air defense network is degraded, what does a realistic rebuild actually look like technically, and how fast could it plausibly happen? Second, why would a state choose to reveal a rebuilt network now, in this scenario, rather than keep it hidden? Third, how would the side that previously enjoyed uncontested air access actually respond, both publicly and privately, if the freedom of action it had grown used to suddenly became uncertain again? And fourth, what does this scenario tell us about the broader, very real pattern of how air superiority is never a permanent state, but a temporary condition that has to be constantly re-earned? Stick with me through this. Before we go further, if this kind of scenario-based breakdown is useful to you, hit like and subscribe, because we're going to keep running these thought experiments on how modern conflicts actually evolve. Drop a comment with your own read on this. In a scenario like this one, would you bet on the rebuilt network holding up under real pressure, or would you expect it to fail the same way the original one did? I want to hear your reasoning. Let's start with the technical question, because it's the most instructive part of this hypothetical. In our scenario, Iran's original air defense network was built around a small number of centralized, high-value radar and missile sites, the kind of architecture that looks impressive on a map but creates a small number of targets that, once mapped, become easy to systematically eliminate. That's the structural weakness every centralized air defense network shares. Concentrate your capability in a few nodes, and you concentrate your vulnerability in exactly the same places. In this hypothetical, after absorbing months of losses, Iran planners make the one decision that actually matters. Instead of rebuilding the same centralized architecture, they disperse it. Dozens of smaller mobile radar units. Shorter-range missile batteries spread across a wider geographic footprint, some hidden in terrain that limits line-of-sight detection, others deliberately positioned near civilian infrastructure to complicate targeting decisions. No single strike takes out the network anymore, because in this scenario there is no longer a single network to take out. There's a distributed mesh, and meshes don't die from a handful of precision strikes. They die slowly, node by node, if they die at all. That shift, in our hypothetical, from centralized to distributed defense is the single most important design decision a degraded military can make, and it's also the hardest one to detect from the outside until it's already operational. Satellite imagery picks up large, fixed installations easily. It struggles to track dozens of mobile units that move every few days. That detection gap is exactly what would make a rebuilt Iran network dangerous in this scenario. Not because any individual component is more advanced than what came before, but because the entire architecture is built to defeat exactly the kind of systematic mapping that dismantled it the first time. Now, to the second question, yes, why would Iran reveal this rebuild now in our hypothetical rather than keep it hidden and use the element of surprise? This is where the scenario gets strategically interesting. A hidden capability only pays off the moment it's used in combat, and by then, the deterrent value is gone, the adversary already committed to the mission that triggered the reveal. A revealed capability, even a partial one, changes behavior immediately before a single missile is fired. In this situational, Iran's leadership calculates that the psychological effect of uncertainty is worth more than the tactical value of surprise. If Israel's Sortie planners can no longer be certain which of their historically safe routes are actually safe, every mission now requires additional risk assessment, additional escort assets, additional caution, all of which slows operational tempo and raises costs. even if the rebuilt network never actually shoots down a single aircraft. In this scenario, the reveal itself is the weapon, which brings us to the third question: how would Israel actually respond in these circumstances, both publicly and behind closed doors? Publicly, in our scenario, Israel officials downplay the development, characterizing it as a partial and unsophisticated rebuild that doesn't fundamentally change the operational picture. That's the kind of statement governments make in almost any scenario like this, real or invented, when they haven't yet finished their own internal assessment and don't want to signal uncertainty. Privately, in this hypothetical, the picture looks different. Sortie planners who had gotten used to running missions along established low-risk corridors now have to treat those same corridors as unverified. Every flight plan gets an added layer of review. Escort and electronic warfare support that used to be optional for routine missions becomes standard for all of them. None of this shows up in a press release. It shows up in mission tempo, in the gap between how many sorties get planned and how many actually launch, and in the growing caution of pilots who, in this scenario, are being asked to fly into an environment they can no longer fully characterize. That's the operational cost of uncertainty, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the same. You don't need to actually defeat an adversary's air force to constrain it. You only need to make them uncertain enough that they constrain themselves. Now let's zoom out, because in this development doesn't exist in isolation. It ripples outward the way real strategic developments always do. Neighboring states watching this scenario unfold would draw their own lessons about how quickly a degraded military can reconstitute meaningful deterrent capability if given the right amount of time and the right design philosophy. Any state currently relying on air superiority as the foundation of its regional strategy would have to ask itself an uncomfortable question. How permanent is air superiority really if a network that was thoroughly dismantled can be meaningfully rebuilt within a matter of months using a fundamentally different architecture? And any external power supplying advanced airframes to the side that had been enjoying uncontested access would have to reassess whether the assumptions underpinning that support, cheap, low-risk missions with minimal attrition, still hold in this new environment. This is the pattern I want to leave you with, because it's the part that generalizes far beyond the Iran and is real. Air superiority has never been a permanent achievement in the real history of air warfare. It's a temporary condition, won through specific tactical and technological advantages that inevitably erode as the losing side studies its own failures and rebuilds around them. Every air force that has ever enjoyed uncontested access to enemy airspace has eventually watched that access narrow, not because its aircraft got worse, but because its adversary's defense got smarter about exploiting the specific weaknesses that made the first version of the network so easy to defeat. That's not a statement about Iran or Israel. Those aren't real places. It's a statement about how degraded military capability actually recovers in the real world, and it's worth remembering the next time any real conflict produces a confident declaration that one side has permanently lost the ability to contest the skies. So here's the question I want to leave you with, framed entirely within scenario. If a dismantled centralized air defense network can be rebuilt as a distributed, harder-to-map mesh in a matter of months, what does that tell us about how fragile the concept of permanent air superiority really is in any conflict anywhere? And if you were advising the side that had gotten comfortable with uncontested access, what would you actually change about your operational assumptions the moment a scenario like this one became plausible? Tell me your take in the comments. I want to know whether you think a rebuilt network like the one in this scenario would actually hold up under sustained pressure, or whether it's a temporary psychological win that collapses the first time it's seriously tested. Like and subscribe if this kind of scenario-based breakdown is useful to you, because we're going to keep running these thought experiments on how modern conflicts really evolve, one hypothetical at a time. I'll see you in the next one.